Okay, now that we've got our entities in place, the next thing to do is to create the DB-Context class that's going to present a session to us so that we can interact with our database, query it, and update it. But we do need to get some extra packages to help us with this, and we need, effectively, these two. The Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design, and because we're going to be using Postgres as our database server, we also need that package as well, specific to the database server we're going to use. I know you Windows guys sometimes prefer to use SQL Server, but because we're going to be having a database per service, what I'd really recommend is you stick with what I'm doing on this course, because Postgres is kind of a lightweight database and it's very easy to get up and running with Docker, which we're going to be using a lot inside our application. I use Postgres because it's the same thing whether you're on Windows, Linux, or a Mac, and SQL Server is, I'm aware there's a Linux version that we can run through Docker as SQL Server, but it's easier if we use something like Postgres, certainly when it comes to what we're doing now and for any future deployment we might do. So I'm going to be installing these two packages, and another thing that we'll need in this particular section is Automapper so that we can shape the data we're returning. So I'm just going to go ahead and install these three packages. Now VS Code doesn't come with a NuGet package manager, so I'm going to head over to the extensions once again, search for NuGet, and I'm going to install NuGet Gallery, which is probably the best one at the moment to install NuGet packages with. Feel free to experiment and try other ones if you wish, but this one works perfectly well for what we're doing. Now inside the background of VS Code we've got the shortcut keys, and this one says show all commands, so I'm going to use that. And then I'm going to look for NuGet, and I'm going to use NuGet open NuGet Gallery. And I'm just going to add the packages we need. So we need Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and we need the design. This one allows us to create migrations, which effectively allows Entity Framework to create the database schema via the code that we've written. So we're going to install this. A couple of laws around Entity Framework packages. Please make sure it matches the runtime version of .NET that you have installed. I've got version 7 of .NET, so this package number matches that, and that's what I'm going to install. It doesn't have to be exact, just the major version. So as long as it's 7 something, that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. We also need the Postgres database provider. So I'll just search for Postgres inside here. And we need MPG SQL, Entity Framework Core PostgreSQL. Once again, as long as it's version 7, or if you're using version 8, then you would need to install version 8 of this. And 7.0.4, the latest major version that matches, is fine. So I'll install this one also, and since we're here I'm just going to install Automapper just to get ahead of what I know we're going to need. And we also need Automapper extensions, Microsoft dependency injection as well. So I'm going to go ahead, tick the box, and install this as well. Excellent. Now that we have these, we can go ahead and we can create our DB-Context class. So we'll go to Solution Explorer, and inside the auction service I'm going to add a new folder called data, and this is going to contain the classes that provide us with data access functionality. I'll add a new file which is going to be a class, and I'm going to call this auction DB context. And once again I'm just going to update the namespace to auction service.data. And this class is going to derive from an entity framework class called DB-Context. And I'm going to put my cursor inside the class name, and I'm going to say generate constructor auction DB-Context with options. And this completes the constructor we need for us to provide the options to the DB-Context base class, which we do here. And when it comes to the options that we need for this, we just need to provide it with the database provider that we're using and the connection string. But we'll do that in the program class, the startup class, when we get to it. And if we hover over DB-Context, we can get a description about what this DB-Context class is. And this represents a session with the database and can be used to query and save instances of our entities. And the DB-Context is a combination of the unit of work and repository patterns. And inside this very simple CRUD service, we're not going to be creating a repository pattern and a units of work pattern when we don't need to, because the DB context itself is already using those patterns, if you're familiar with those patterns. If you're not, don't worry about it for now. We'll talk about that kind of stuff a bit later. For now, we're just doing the bare minimum that we need to do to get a CRUD application up and running. So inside this DB context class, we need to tell it about the entities that we have in our project. So we're going to have a DB set, as that is what we use to tell Entity Framework. And we just need the DB set for the auction. And we're going to call it auctions, as table names in databases are typically pluralized. We don't need to specify the item inside here because our item is related to the auction, and Entity Framework is going to create the table for the item as well as the auctions because they're related. But what it won't do is give it a pluralized name for the item. So we will go back in and go to the item class, and just above the class name, we're just going to specify table and specify the name of the table we want it to be called. And I'm just going to call it items, as conventionally that's how table names are typically written. So by doing this, Entity Framework is going to pick that up and it's going to say, aha, I see you want a table name called items, and that's what it will do. So a few more steps to go. We're going to go to, now we have a DB context class, we're going to go across to our program class. And typically, by the way, go to file is the fastest way to locate a class you're looking for inside your project. You can, of course, use Solution Explorer and open it up this way, but it does take a bit more time and effort, especially if you've got your Solution Explorer hidden, as I normally would do. It's just way faster to go to file and then open up the class you want to open. So we're going to add a service to our container for the DB context. This particular class, the DB context, is something that we're going to want to inject into classes that need to get access to something in our database. So we add this as a service, and then we use dependency injection in order to make use of that service. So we're going to add it here, and we're going to say builder.services, and we're going to use add DB context, and we're going to specify the name of the DB context we've created, the auction DB context, and then we're going to specify the options here, and we'll open up the arrow, and then we can specify opt, and we want to use MPG SQL, and the auto import didn't work for this one, so let's see if we can use the quick fix so that we can bring in the using statement we need. And if I use the shortcut for that, which in my case is command and period, then we get to see the using statement that we need. You can also use the light bulb on the left, and this will give us the quick fix option to bring in using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, which is where we get the import for this particular method that we're about to use. Now this takes a connection string as its argument, and we'll specify builder.configuration, and we've got an option here to go and get the connection string, and we're going to call our connection string default connection, and then close off these parentheses with semicolons. So we're going to go out to our configuration and get our connection string, which means we need to define that inside our configuration. Now, I mentioned earlier on we've got a couple of configuration files we can use for this purpose, and since we're running in development mode, we can add our connection string information into appsettings.development.json. So I'm just going to add a comma after the logging, and when I open the quotes, one of the options it auto lets us know about is connection strings, and inside the curly brackets I'm going to say default connection, and then we need to supply a Postgres server connection string, which looks like this. So we're going to say server equals local host. That's what it's going to be running on port number 5432, which is the default port for Postgres. We're going to have a user ID that's equal to just Postgres. That is the default user that's created when we create a Postgres database server. We're going to give it a password of POSTGres PW, And I would highly recommend in development you stick to simple passwords. This is not going out onto the internet, this is just running on your local machine, and I don't know how many development hours have been lost by developers typing in wrong passwords because they've given themselves a difficult, complex password to remember, but I imagine it's a lot. So I do recommend you stick with simple passwords for development. And then following this, we add another semicolon, and we give the database a name, and this is going to be called auctions. And now we have the connection string in place. We're in a position now where we can actually go ahead and create our migration. So let's go to the terminal once again, and we want to actually stop our application when we do this, and we also need to be inside the auction service folder. Now we need a tool for this called .NET EF, and you may or may not have it installed already, but we can check this by saying .NET Tool List -G for global tools and press return. Now you may already have this installed, I certainly do, but if you do not, then you need to run the command .NET Tool Install and specify .NET -EF and -G so it's installed globally, and press return. Now I've already got it installed, so it's not going to work again. But it should work for you if you did not have it installed. If you've got it installed but you've got an older version, then what you can run is instead of .NET Tool Install, you can run .NET Tool Update, and that'll go out and get the latest version of this tool. And once we have that in place, we can then execute the commands to create a new migration, which is going to take a look at our code and what we've written, the DB context class, and it's going to create a migration that will set up the database schema based on the code that we've written. So I'm going to say .NET EF migrations add, and I'll just give the migration a name of initial create, and I'm going to output the migration to a folder inside data folder and specify data / migrations and press return. And as long as there's no problems in our code, then this should work just fine. If you do get any problems at this stage, then please do double check your connection string. This is important that the syntax is accurate. If you've got a comma instead of a semicolon, then that's going to fail. If you're missing any semicolons, that's going to fail. And another thing to check is inside the program class that your connection string is free from typos, and make sure that you've got this that matches exactly what you have inside here. And the other place to look, of course, is the auction DB context, and make sure that there are no mistakes inside this class. You're deriving from DB context, you've got the constructor set up properly, and you've got your DB set up as here as well. But if it did work, then you should be good to go, and inside your data folder, inside migrations, then you've got 3 files in here, but this is the one we're interested in, the initial create.cs, and this tells us what is going to happen when we update our database. It's going to create a table called auctions with our auction properties and a table called items with our item properties. But of course, we do not have a database server at this moment in time. So what we'll take a look at next is adding Postgres into Docker so that we can actually use this migration to update a database.